I'm ready for all today, through all the pain, all the way, the fight for all, my life, the love, we're taking it all the way, all the way.
So anything in life needs a good foundation. For example, a house. You need a good foundation, or else a hurricane, earthquake, or a natural disaster. For example, you drafted Jonathan Taylor last year in the first round. Anything can happen. Relationships need a good foundation. You can't be catfishing each other, can't be lying. I mean, unless you're into that, that's fine. But it's not a good foundation. But more importantly, your fantasy team needs a solid foundation. It needs that solid structure that's going to take you to the fantasy playoffs. And after that, you know what? Good luck in the championship. But right now in today's episode, we're definitely going to be talking about foundational pieces, because the early round picks, in my personal opinion, are the foundation. And today with me is Rich Hribar from the Sharp Football Analyst, author of the weekly worksheet, and contributor to the 2024 Sharp Preview book that just released today on Amazon, and Sharp Football Analysis. Hopefully I didn't stutter horribly and misinterpret that, but hey, welcome to the show.
What's the good word? Listen, if we're going to be laying foundation, you need some rebar, right?
That is true. That is true. That's a good one right there.
That was well played. That was well played on your lane there.
Oof. All righty. So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the early round draft pick must-haves, because obviously, you know, we'll be talking about picks later on in the episode, and we'll be talking about definitely the future picks in future episodes, whether it's the later rounds or the guys that you don't want specifically. But the foundational pieces are in the early rounds, because they're the ones that are going to be starting every week, every matchup, regardless, you know, I mean, unless there's a bye week, but regardless of the matchup, even if they're playing a tough defense, congratulations, you're starting Christian McCaffrey, right? You're starting your CD Lamb, you're starting your Tyreek Hill, but it doesn't matter if they're having a tough matchup. You're still going to expect them to produce, because they are that foundational piece. And because of that, I don't want to say you can't get it wrong, because obviously you can still survive with having early round bust, but of course it puts yourself in a much more favorable position if you are able to get it right. And of course, in this episode, we're going to be talking a lot about those foundational pieces, because there's a lot that goes into it, not just player talent. It's going to be the scheme that they're in, the situation, the division they play against, and of course the other surrounding pieces around that player that's going to take away those targets, receptions, catches, touchdowns, and all that good stuff. So, Rich, a lot of the times draft strategies gets talked about, and the meta has changed. I don't know if you're familiar with the term meta.
Oh yeah.
But the meta has significantly changed over, I want to say, even from this year's draft to last year's draft, significant switch. But over last year to maybe 2 years ago, huge switch in the meta in the early rounds, because I believe even in half point PPR and football and PPR, there would be a run on running backs. And I'm sure this is always discussed in episodes, but usually running backs go early and often. But now, as I look at the ADPs, that's not happening. Can you explain about it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that's gone into it, you know, over the course of time. I mean, largely the first initial imprint is that we've lost the traditional like bell cow fantasy backs that kind of were part of like yesteryear. Definitely, listen, I'm showing my age, but I was, you know, I've been playing fantasy football since the 90s. I mean, you've got dudes like Emmitt Smith that are racking up 400 touches a year. Like those guys have just kind of dried up. The game has changed. More teams are going to compartmentalize backfields. We've also seen like a giant shift in, like you said, not only the meta of drafting, but like the meta of how offenses are constructed to beat defenses. Now we've got more 3 wide receiver sets. Like I said, more guys playing, you know, just roles in offense, or be an early down back, a 3-down back, guys come out at the goal line. All these things kind of go into it. And we just no longer have like these high workload running backs anymore. And granted, we still have Christian McCaffrey, but even last year, there was just a gigantic gap from Christian McCaffrey to the RB2. This time of year, one thing that always irks me is people will always bring up stuff like this guy was the RB2 or this was the RB5 or the wide receiver 7 without context of what that meant. I mean, the RB2 last year only produced 67% of the points Christian McCaffrey scored last year. Like, having the RB2 was still like, it was advantageous over the RB3, sure, but like it didn't put you in the stratosphere of Christian McCaffrey. So like we've lost like those kind of players. The other thing too is like we've seen kind of a shift in how fantasy's played in a lot of sites. We've seen receptions are now rewarded on a lot of sites. That wasn't something like when I was coming up and playing fantasy, that was, there. And then roster allocation matters too. Like, now do you start 3 wide receivers on a site versus 2? Are there flex spots? There's all these things that go into it because the wide receiver position now becomes more enhanced and more kind of, you need to use more roster allocation towards it in those types of formats. So like there's a lot that's kind of gone in and shifted towards it. But right now, as it stands, we just don't have those kind of like players, the top of the running back position, like the LaDainian Tomlinsons, like the even if you go back like even like a decade ago, like the LaShawn McCoys of the world, the Matt Fortes, like those guys have kind of dried up. We have a very finite number of those players. We have Christian McCaffrey, and then we have kind of like a little mini tier where it's Bijan Robinson and Breece Hall. And then you get a huge gap because even when you get to kind of the guy that's the consensus RB4 this year in Jahmyr Gibbs, he also doesn't have that profile. He shares a backfield with David Montgomery, sometimes comes out at the goal line. Even he starts to have a little bit of like, chinks in his armor and doesn't have like that full kind of workload that even a Christian McCaffrey has. So you hit that gap immediately at the round 1, round 2 turn in fantasy drafts right now. Whereas, in years past, you might have 3, 4, 5 of those guys that maybe like existed on the fantasy spectrum. And it just kind of dwindled since like, dwindled recently, like the last decade or so.
Yeah, and more importantly, in a fantasy football aspect. So if you're playing in a half-point PPR league, your wide receiver has a catch. Maybe he only gains 5 yards. In relative terms, that's not necessarily the best NFL play, but hey, fantasy football, that's one whole point right there. Now, if a running back gets a carry and he averages 5 yards, he's halfway to the Hall of Fame. It's a lot harder I don't want to say it's a lot harder for a running back to accumulate fantasy points, but a lot more has to happen. He has to get 20 touches. If he averages 5 yards a touch, then that's 100 yards. 100 yards, that's a phenomenal game for a running back. But realistically, that's 10 fantasy points. It's not going to be that much in the grand scheme of things. He has to get a touchdown to really solidify his role as a impact player on your fantasy lineup. While wide receiver, he has 5 catches, 60, 70 yards. That's an average game. Maybe that's even a below average game for some wide receivers. But then again, he still had a somewhat of an impact on your fantasy lineup. And that's why I think a lot of people are now slightly moving over towards wide receivers, just because a lot less has to happen for them to accumulate fantasy points, and teams are just kind of throwing the ball a little bit more, and they find ways. Like, a Shanahan scheme, they'll find ways to get receivers open, swing passes, get itself a Deebo Samuel to give it to him in the backfield. George Kittle, they'll find even a tight end screen out of all the stuff like that. For example, what they would do on their side of the football, it's just a lot easier for them to accumulate fantasy points. Would you agree or disagree?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, especially like I said, the way scoring has kind of shifted in fantasy football. More sites are rewarding, different aspects of the game. And, you can do some things to make kind of running backs more relevant. Like whether you do like a quarter point per carry or, points per first downs can give running backs some more juice too, but this still helps wide receivers. The bottom line is like the top fantasy scorers of a given season are typically wide receivers now versus, like I said, we only have a couple running backs a year. We haven't had that span where like we're popping off like 3 or 4 like really elite running backs, and we're typically in a season it's like 1 or 2 guys.
And especially the chances of an injury from a wide receiver to running back is severe. The chances are the running back you draft is going to miss at least 1 week due to an injury. It's a little bit less likely that a wide receiver misses a week due to injury. Of course, there are the Kevin Whites out there where a wide receiver is always injured and never is able to get onto the field, but it's more likely that a running back gets hurt than a wide receiver. So let's talk about draft strategies, because Yahoo usually likes to always throw out some statistics in the beginning of the year, and they always say that pick number 6, 106, always has the highest chance of winning the fantasy league. Have you ever heard that statistic, Rich?
No, I know there was a study done at Rotoviz like a few years ago that showed like the back third was like definitely the weakest though, like in
Definitely.
typical drafts. But I mean, there's a lot of variance that goes into like any type of like that type of analysis. You know, if you play a lot of best ball and you do a lot of that stuff like right now, like you're pretty well versed of drafting from like all the spots. So I mean, I'm someone that takes like a lot of that stuff and say like, I don't really get hung up on that. I feel like I'd be successful from any spot I pick. But you know, it depends. Everyone has their favorite pockets where they like the draft from.
Yeah, I know a lot of people favor the end of the, even though you just said it's a little bit weaker at the end, but a lot of people kind of favor the end just because you get to kind of double tap a couple players and you have your ability to kind of grab who you want. But then again, a lot of the times I feel like personally when I'm at the end, I'm forced to draft players I don't necessarily want, just because the players I do want either got taken already, obviously, or or I know they're not going to come back to me 24 picks later. So I have to, even if I'm reaching a little bit and I want that player, I got to take him because I know he's not coming back to me. And that kind of puts you in awkward situations. While I do think that the 106 or the 6th pick, you kind of have the ability to kind of go for the value. You can kind of have the ability to kind of, slide, glide, what's the term? Zig while everyone zags, or zag while everyone zigs. Kind of ability to have flexibility in your lineup. I feel like the ends, whether you're in the beginning or the end, you don't necessarily have that flexibility. So real quick, while we're talking about drafting and draft strategies, are you a person this year you're going for the running backs or you're going for the wide receivers? I know a lot of people like to say, "Oh, I'm going for the value pick," but is there a preference?
Mostly, I am more of a wide receiver driven gamer, but it also just depends on the format, right? Like, you know, I'm someone that gets afforded to play in a lot of fantasy football leagues. I play in a ton of leagues, so I don't really kind of glom on to specific players as much as, you know, what is the format I'm playing? How many players do I have to start? What's the scoring system? And where am I picking from? Because like we kind of let in there, like, especially in the early part of the draft, like your first 4 players you get for, like, I would say like, yeah, like at least the first 4 rounds before things start to get kind of nebulous and you can start to see kind of like a wider range of ADP where like ADP is not as tight or like your draft may not follow the specific ADP board. Who you end up with is typically gonna be like what draft slot you have, right? Like we're only going to shuffle the like top 48 players up so much. Like you might have a reach in one of those rounds or someone slide, but like it's not going to be egregious, right? Like typically the guys you come out with like with a 4-star picks are going to be dependent on where you are. So like I said, I don't really kind of get hung up in like saying like I have to have this specific player. I'm mostly playing it by like, all right, what draft slot do I have? What is the scoring structure here and how many like players do I have to start? What's the allocation here? And I'll kind of go by that. And then I will let that kind of be the driver of kind of like where the draft goes through the middle rounds, like the late rounds and stuff like that. But I know not everyone has that luxury. You know, you might be playing in one office league. You might be playing with like some friends, have 1 to 3 leagues. And, you know, you kind of want to say like, all right, well, who's a dude I need to take here at this spot? And I totally get that as well. So I do understand that too as well, but like I am afforded like kind of the luxury of like saying like, hey, structure first, and that's always going to matter. Like, right, like that's always going to be the most important thing is you know playing it structurally. Like if you're in a league that rewards like quarterback, I see this all the time, especially in my field. Like someone would be like, well, what about my league? It scores this, this, and this, and I can't write. And I can't do content creation based on every single scoring format out there, especially when you start to get into like house leagues and everything. It's like, dude, our league does this and we do that. It's like, yeah, then you should alter your approach for it if you're doing something where it's like it values quarterbacks more, values running backs more, or something like that. So you always have to take into account what are you playing first? What's the game you're playing? You know, is it then you talk about like some things I brought up, like best ball, like that's a whole different animal, right? Like where you're not setting a lineup every week. Are you having to set a lineup every week? There's just all these different elements that go into it. And I think gamers get it wrong where they do focus specifically too much on just like, you know, specific players where they're just like, you know what, I have my draft coming up and I just have to have Breece Hall. Like I just have to have him. But like, what if you do? It's a full PPR league, and your league starts 3 wide receivers in the flex. So you might not want to force a running back in that spot. It might, you know, be something that you know pushes you towards wide receiver. What if you have pick 103 Are you going to take Breece Hall there, right? Like you have to ask yourself that question. All these different things come into play with it. But I definitely think, people glom on to like specific players far too much in fantasy football. You're going to get a lot of it wrong. You're going to get a lot of player projection wrong. Team structure and you build around the format will always be something that leads you to success more often than just saying, I got this player right.
Now, real quick, in past years, usually 101 is kind of debatable. There's usually an argument for multiple players. This year, it's Christian McCaffrey, only Christian McCaffrey. You take Christian McCaffrey.
I mean, you don't have to. I don't think it's necessarily that you have to. I mean, I think you can make a case, like I said, if you're in these full PPR formats, because here's the thing: if you're in these full PPR formats where you start 3 wide receivers and there's flex and God forbid there's multiple flexes where the wide receiver position comes important, being even more enhanced, then you can make an argument, say, if I take Christian McCaffrey, like the wide receivers that come back, are they strong enough versus like what running backs are typically there if I were to take a Tyreek Hill or a CeeDee Lamb? I think you can have that conversation. The last time a running back was the RB1 in back-to-back seasons was Priest Holmes. Like, you got to go all the way back to Priest Holmes. So like you said, it's a volatile position. Inherently, guys get hurt. More often than not, I'm going to take Christian McCaffrey because of like I said, the way the structure like it kind of typically falls in drafts. But like I think you can make a case if you're in those formats to take a CeeDee Lamb or a Tyreek Hill as well. Though I wouldn't push back on it like extensively.
Yeah. Usually I always say you're 101, just take the best running back. Like it'll make your life a little bit easier. At least in my
I would like probably dollars of donuts 90% of the time still take Christian McCaffrey, but like I said, I think you can make a case at least for those other guys.
Sounds like a plan. All right, now so go ahead. Did you have a thought to finish?
No, that's it.
Okay. So right now you're in the early run of the draft, and I want to give you a mini scenario. It's not that crazy. Right. So you're pick 104. McCaffrey, CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, they're off. They're the consensus usually about like 1, 2, and 3. And right now, of course, you're sitting at pick number 4, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, BJ Robinson. They're kind of there for the taking. Now, if it's half point PPR, does it really change anything? Like you're going Jamar Chase only, or is it like a personal preference where you want to change between Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson? Or take me on your thought process on that one.
Yeah, so typically in that spot, I mean, like if I'm not able to get one of like what I believe is like a clear tier cutoff that like you said, like Christian McCaffrey, Tyreek Hill, CeeDee Lamb. I mean, my next favorite player is Bijan Robinson. So like I have no problem, kind of taking him in that spot. Like I think he has like Christian McCaffrey level like range in his output. I think when you look at what all the changes that have happened in Atlanta this offseason, moving on from Arthur Smith to Zach Robinson, who comes from this coaching tree that has been successful. I mean, when you think about like the current defensive meta right now and where it's at, I mean, you're seeing a lot of 2 high safeties. We're seeing more zone coverage played in the NFL, less blitzing. And there's a reason why guys from the Shanahan coaching tree and the McVay coaching tree keep getting jobs. And it's because those 2 systems are designed to kind of put defenses in a box to where like, if you want to play 2 high stuff, that's great. We're going to run the football on you and we're going to be able to run successfully with outside zone. And then if you want to come up and play the pass, we can come up and play the run. We can pass out of running sets too, as well. Like I said, I don't think that there's a coincidence that all these guys keep getting hired from these 2 specific coaching trees, because they're kind of, if you look across the landscape of the NFL, these are the 2 systems that are having the most success in the current defensive meta and the way teams are attacking offenses. So Zach Robinson coming over, I think is absolutely huge. It's easy to make a case for like, Bijan Robinson have like Todd Gurley-esque usage in year 2 in this offense. I mean, you look at last year, he was 5th in running backs in total yards. He only had 50% of his backfield touches. The 4 guys ahead of him had 69.5%, 72%, 62%, and 76%. Like that's like a huge gap. If we get him up to like that 65 to 70% range, like those other running backs, I mean, we're talking about potential to have like a 2,000 yard season, like a guy that can attack defenses in all capacities. And then you look at the Atlanta Falcons, they have our number 1 rushing projected schedule this season. You get Kirk Cousins in there. They're 13th in projected points scored now on Vegas lines. If you look at Vegas lines and just right now, use Vegas lines to hash out which teams are projected to score the most points. The Atlanta Falcons are projected to be 13th, and they were, a bottom 7 team in total points last year. I went back and forth early in the process between Bijan and Breece Hall because they're very similar players and on similar career paths. But I think when you talk about the schedule, the offensive line for Atlanta being better than the Jets, and the Jets did very much improve their offensive line this offseason, but they did it in like a capacity that still is fragile. You know, when you talk about, you know, Tyron Smith, you know, Morgan Moses, John Simpson, these are guys in the older end of the spectrum that you're counting on still a young player in Elijah Vera Tucker to get healthy and stay on the field. I still think Atlanta, their offensive line is better objectively on paper. Where the Jets have our 28th rushing schedule too. They play in a much tougher division than the Atlanta Falcons do. And then also the other thing too, I think I had Stefania Bell on my podcast from ESPN a couple weeks ago, and she talked about that ACL injuries, that when they have their current reoccurrence rate is within 22 months of the previous ACL. So I use all those things to kind of split the hairs in favor of Bijan Robinson for Breece Hall. But anyone that does like Breece Hall more, I don't really have like a ton of pushback besides like the reason why I laid out why I like Bijan a little bit more. But those two running backs, I think that those three guys paired to Christian McCaffrey, that's the archetype of running back that expires in fantasy football drafts at the front. Once those three guys are gone, I mean, I'm not taking a running back for several rounds. Like, you know, I think you can make a case for like guys like Saquon and Jonathan Taylor, but like those guys are not playing those 3 downs. They do not have like all these things that line up for them. They play with mobile quarterbacks, which is something we don't want in fantasy football. You do not want your running back playing with a mobile quarterback. He takes goal line carries, and mobile quarterbacks have shown that they have lower check down rates, which you said, like we want those catches from our running backs. They get the PPR points. So the Bijan Robinson is like the guy that I'm pretty much like I'm hammering while I can get him, and especially in that spot, because I know in the second round those two guys are gone. Like I'm not getting either of those players when I get to pick again.
Yeah, and as a person who was heavily into DeAndre Swift last year, every tush push hurt my soul so bad. Oh my! The amount of times he got tackled on the 1 yard line, just
you
to
can see
there.
it. When the Eagles, like when DeAndre Swift got tackled at like the 1, like he knew that he knew.
He was pissed himself. He knew it.
Everyone knew. He knew what the hell was coming the next play.
Yeah. You know what? I blame it on him. It's a skill issue. Just get in the end zone next time. God damn it, Swift. All right. So you're at pick number 4. You're going Bijan Robinson.
More cases than not. Yeah.
More cases than not.
I will say so. Like, let's lay another hypothetical out. Like, you brought up like Jamar Chase. I actually favor a couple of guys a little bit more, and I have no problem with Jamar Chase. Like, I think he's an amazing player, an elite talent. Like, the Bengals have one of our hardest schedules in the NFL. They have our number 32 ranked passing schedule. It doesn't matter for a guy like Jamar Chase as much as it does for a guy like Joe Burrow. But if you've seen kind of like some of the performances Joe Burrow's had, especially in division games, he only has a 33% QB1 rate in AFC North games and a 55% QB1 rate in games outside of the AFC North. And that's impacted Jamar Chase. In 15 career games against the AFC North, Jamar Chase only has been a wide receiver 1 in 5 games. So like there is a little bit of floor pulling there. I do think we're going to see Jamar Chase play a lot more slot this season. His slot rate's gone up every year. And then especially when you talk about Tyler Boyd leaving, they bring in Jermaine Burton. He just profiles more to have some more success there than some of the other guys they have on their roster. Charlie Jones is like the only other pure slot guy that they have on the roster. So I think when they're a team that plays a ton of 11 personnel, 3 wide receiver sets. So I think Chase is going to kick inside a lot more and continue to increase the slot rate this year. But I think when you look at a player that's kind of not considered in that same ilk of those other guys, but I think has just an amazing fantasy case to be considered that highly, is Amon-Ra St. Brown. The Detroit Lions play 1 outdoor game the first 13 weeks of the season. Like we're getting Jared Goff indoors. There's hardly any target competition. It's him and Sam Laporta, and they're hoping Jameson Williams takes a step. The player that was number three on the team in targets last year was Jahmyr Gibbs. Number 4 on the team, Josh Reynolds, is no longer on the roster. And we're getting a guy, like when you talk about beating the current defensive meta, Amon-Ra St. Brown is a guy that does that. Like he's basically going to walk into the season with 100 receptions. So if you're in these full PPR formats, I don't want to overlook Amon-Ra St. Brown, especially when like that firewall of like CeeDee Lamb and Tyreek are gone. I think Amon-Ra St. Brown belongs in that conversation as well. And we've seen him make like a significant jump in like explosive plays last year. That was like what we were lacking like the first 2 years. He was kind of a pure slot guy. Last year he moves out. He actually played a lower rate of snaps in the slot than CeeDee Lamb did last year. And he had 22 catches of 20 or more yards his first 2 seasons in the NFL. He had 24 receptions of 20 or more yards last year. So we're getting to see like the Amon-Ra St. Brown like fully develop that full field game like these other wide receiver other wide receiver ones. I don't think he's regarded like with those other guys, but that's the company like he should be keeping, especially in fantasy football circuits.
So Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, you're taking Justin Jefferson over Jamar Chase.
No. I'm probably still taking Jamar Chase in that situation. It literally is because we just lived this life last year where we saw how much elite wide receivers were impacted by surrounding quarterback play. And part of that was Justin Jefferson, right? Like he was the 5 games that he played without Kirk Cousins, he was a wide receiver 1 in only 2 of those games. So he had 2 of the 6. So, like, there still is a floor potential here. We saw Devontae Adams completely just impacted by his situation last year. Garrett Wilson's had now 2 years running. DJ Moore, he had a 5-week stretch last season with Tyson Bagent, was absolutely cooked. Jamar Chase played a stretch of the season without Joe Burrow, and Jake Browning was completely impacted. Like, we live this life, right? We know there's fragility. Yes, there is a very low bar for Sam Darnold or JJ McCarthy to come in and clear and be as good as what the Vikings had in place of Kirk Cousins at the end of last year. But we also know that there's fragility there as well, too. So I'm not fading Justin Jefferson, but I do think that when you're talking about like these first round picks and bust potential, like I see a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown basically almost being like outside of injury, like he's very safe and has the upside those other guys play. And then when we're talking about Joe Burrow versus, can Sam Darnold or JJ McCarthy be Joe Burrow? I'm probably saying no. Can they be better than Nick Mullins and Jared McCarthy and Joshua Dobbs? Yes. But I mean, I'm probably using that to split hairs. I'm not going to like fade Justin Jefferson to the second round or anything, but when these elite players are in the same tier, he kind of like loses some of those splitting hair kind of arguments, I think, for me.
Yeah, because right now, personally, I would probably pick Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and then Justin Jefferson. Would you call that a fair assessment, or would you push back on that?
No, I think that's fair. I think that's about the area where I'm looking. I will say I don't want to ignore, AJ Brown either as part of that conversation. I mean, you look at the players the last 2 years that have gone over, 1,400 yards, and it's him and Tyreek Hill at wide receiver, right? Like those are the guys that in terms of receiving. And like there was a point last year where AJ Brown was the best wide receiver in football outside of Tyreek Hill. And then like we all saw that firewall that happened with the Eagles last year. Jalen Hurts has the knee injury, like the midway through the season, like that entire offense kind of fell off. I also think that, the Eagles moving on from Brian Johnson this year for Kellen Moore, and, Kellen Moore's had his faults, but like when you look at the Eagles passing game, it became very stale. They didn't do anything creative. Their use of play action last year, moving on from Shane Steichen to Brian Johnson, went from 30% down to 25.8%. Their rate of pre-snap motion, from 34% down to 27%. Like these are like cheat codes in offense that improve efficiency. So we're going to get those, kind of back incorporated into this Eagles offense. And when you look at like AJ Brown's history, like in terms of like, on terms of plays with motion, he's averaged 2.8 yards per out run on those types of plays since he's come into the league, which is 5th among all wide receivers. So I do still think that there's upside argument to be made for AJ Brown too, in terms of having kind of like, being one of those picks that kind of also like sometimes he falls to like the pure like round 1, round 2 turn. And it's like a gift at that point.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you. I definitely want somebody like AJ Brown on my fantasy lineup. The only question I have is, have they fixed the man blitzes? Because I think that was the biggest thing that derailed them last year is they had no pass protection answers for overload blitzes while playing man defense on the back end. And that's what I'm kind of curious to see if they fixed anything on that sort. But AJ Brown, if like you said, if he's on the turn, I'm going for him. I'm double clicking it right away. So that being said, we're kind of, I don't want to say we're nailing Justin Jefferson right here, but are we taking AJ Brown over him, or is that too much of a reach?
I think it depends. I think in formats that favor more like touchdowns, like half point PPR, I think there's an argument to be made for it. For AJ Brown, having a little bit of safety net and potentially even more, potential, scoring upside, potential to get double-digit touchdowns, with the Eagles offense versus what we see could happen with the Vikings this year. I mean, there's just a lot of unknowns with the Vikings. I think we can pencil in Justin Jefferson for like a 30% target share though. And that's good. Like I just want to throw that volume at the wall. We just need better quarterback play than what we got, the back, 6 games of last year. And I know he did have the huge game, with Nick Mullins as well. So like we take that into account that he's capable to get over, but his 6 games without Kirk Cousins looked a lot similar to what Devontae Adams was. You'd had spike week, down week, spike week, down week. And that's very tough because you're not taking these guys out of your lineup, right? And it's very frustrating for gamers to kind of go through like that ebb and tide of that roller coaster ride that we saw. Like, because, I had Devontae Adams leagues. You know how it is. Like, are you going to get, is this a week where Devontae Adams has the 38 yards receiving, or is it a week where these 12 targets turn into, 10 receptions? It's a very tough ride to take.
Okay. But you said there's an argument, but which one are you personally doing?
I'm probably still taking Jefferson just because of the raw number of targets I think he's going to get. Like, it's like, because even last year, like we did the Adams roller coaster, but Adams still had 180 targets. If you're telling me I'm going to get like 160 to 180 Justin Jefferson targets, which I think you can easily get to this year, because TJ Hawkinson, we don't know when he's coming back this year. Like we just don't know when he's going to be available to play. He's going to be at basically 7 months at the start of the season from his ACL recovery. Like we might not see him for 2 months of the season. He may never be 100% this year either. And then the Vikings always were an 11 personnel team. They let KJ Osborne go this offseason. And you say KJ Osborne, big deal, but like they don't really have a wide receiver 3 on this roster. Brandon Powell right now is the wide receiver 3 on the roster. Maybe Trent Sherfield. Like these are not guys that are command targets. So like Justin Jefferson is going to get thrown the football a ton, an absolutely ton. So like, I kind of just want to say like, all right, Jesus, take the wheel. I'm going to take these 180 targets. Let it go.
Let's go. So give me a must-have player. Let's go to the main topic of conversation. I know we were going to like must-haves, and we kind of
I think it's fun to walk through that stuff, right?
Yes, it's definitely fun to walk through like guys and situations and hypotheticals. I love hypotheticals. I can go through hypotheticals all day long, whether it's fantasy football related or not. But give me a hypothetical situation. It forces you to at least think logically and kind of put yourself in a scenario. Okay, I'd rather do this. I'd take this player over this guy, this player, division, team scheme, and all that good stuff. But give me a guy that you want on your fantasy lineup. I know it's a little bit of a vague question, but try your best with this one.
Yeah, and like that, I think people get a lot of like what we went through, like those hypotheticals, because you hear like when you hear the encompassing conversation that surrounds, and instead of just saying this player good, take good player. I think that helps a lot more people, especially when they get in their drafts, because it helps you ad lib, right? Like you might have the pick 108 in your work league, and you might do 100 mock drafts before then, and this one player is always there at 108, but when you do the one live draft, he's gone, and you're like, what do I do now? Yes. Like, so it's fun to talk about that stuff. I'll say like starting like post Bijan, like post like some of those guys we already walked through, like the Amon-Ra's, AJ Browns, those are all gone. The first guy is Garrett Wilson, right? Like, like I still think when you look at Garrett Wilson, we know there's a special player here. He has just been limited by, offensive situation. We lose Rodgers 4 snaps into the year last year. He still has 1,000 yards with the gag. He's had over 1,000 yards back-to-back seasons playing with like literally vagabond level quarterback play. Over the past 2 seasons, 16.5% of his targets were just uncatchable, deemed inaccurate by the quarterback. Like no player could have caught them. The only player with a higher inaccurate target rate over the past 2 years that has as many targets as Garrett Wilson over that span is Devontae Adams, who lost Aaron Rodgers, over those 2 years. So we do have Aaron Rodgers, age 41, coming off that Achilles, but the bar is so low for him to be better than what Garrett Wilson has played with so far through this point of his career. Also, I think you can make it's the money targets, right? That's what I think is the most important for Garrett Wilson, because we know like he's just going to get a gaggle of targets still again. They add Mike Williams coming off the ACL. They draft Malachi Corley. These are still not guys that are going to threaten for huge target shares in the context of pulling away from Garrett Wilson. But so Garrett Wilson, you look at where his targets have been inaccurate, it's the red zone targets. 38.1% of his end zone targets, his throws into the end zone, have been inaccurate, uncatchable. Think about that. 38% have been uncatchable for him. 34% of his deep targets, targets 20 or more yards downfield. These are the targets that get you like big fantasy points. 34% of those have been inaccurate. Like, it's just hard to find guys that have like as bad as, metrics as that in terms of like just having an opportunity to make plays. So getting Aaron Rodgers there in that capacity is just going to be huge for him. And then I think you can also make the case that Wilson is the best raw talent entering the NFL that Rodgers has ever had. Sure, we now in hindsight know Devontae Adams would be pushing to make the Hall of Fame. Jordy Nelson could potentially push the Hall of Fame. Those guys were second round players though. The Packers never took a first round wide receiver when Aaron Rodgers was there. So Christian Watson was taken at pick 34. He was the highest wide receiver taken while Aaron Rodgers was with the Packers. And do you remember what Christian Watson did in rookie season when he was available and fully healthy? You don't think Garrett Wilson is capable of doing that? So Garrett Wilson, I know that Garrett Wilson didn't burn us last year. That what happened around and the situation deteriorating around him burned us. Could that happen again? Sure, but we can't bank on the quarterback getting hurt 4 plays again to the season. We're going back to the well.
So right now, Aaron Rodgers missed mandatory minicamp to go on a vacation to Egypt. Now, while Egypt and see the pyramids, that's cool. But
the Illuminati, he's part of the Illuminati, isn't he?
I have no idea. It's hard to keep up with him anymore. Do you really trust Aaron Rodgers to sit there and be healthy and to be able to play? First of all, be competent. I don't want to say be competent or still not be rusty. I don't want to use those kind of terms for Aaron Rodgers. I feel like he's proved that he deserves some sort of respect on that part. But health-wise, I think it's a big issue because all it takes is for him to get hurt again. And at this point,
well, they are more better insulated this year than years past with Tyrod Taylor as the backup. I mean, Tyrod Taylor would by far and away be the best quarterback Garrett Wilson has also played with to this point in his career.
Yes, that is true. And that's almost sad to say now that I think about it. But I know obviously every wide receiver is fantasy stock, depends on the quarterback. But God, it's hard to sit there and say hey, you know what? This guy's quarterback isn't going to derail your season.
I mean, all those guys we named about though, they all have just uber fragility, right?
Yeah.
Is Trey Lance going to come in for the Cowboys and float your CD Lamb stock, right?
Oh God.
I guess you can make an argument. Maybe Mike White is okay, but is Mike White floating Tyreek Hill? There aren't very many viable backup quarterback situations in the league. So that's something that's very tough, right? We look at a lot of these the running backs and stuff, their backup running backs, and this guy can come in and do this. There are very few quarterback situations though where you're just not bound if the quarterback gets hurt. Yeah.
And that's kind of one of also the big reasons why
Tyrod actually might be one of the better ones.
Yeah, no, he's probably number 2. Him. I guess Sam Darnold would be probably one of the better ones as well. I'm trying to think of another one.
It's all bad, man. I mean, that's what's funny about if you want to rail the Falcons for taking Michael Penix, but if you're a fantasy gamer, you're taking Drake London or you're going back to Kyle Pitts. At least if Kirk Cousins were to get hurt, you're hey, I mean, at least this is better than a lot of quarterback situations that are probably across the league.
Yeah, that is true at that point. And you also have to think there's a lot of injury-prone quarterbacks in the NFL. Like Joe Burrow, I think he had 1 season so far where he's played a full season. I mean, other than that, he's had, his ACL, the UCL in his arm. He had a couple high ankle sprains. Yeah, I mean, he's been injury prone just as well. So, I mean, Jamar Chase, you're taking him with the risk of Joe Burrow as well. I mean, that could be said for any quarterback,
right,
in the NFL. But you know what? Sometimes some players just get hurt more than others. A lot of people say, injury prone is luck based or it's not a real thing to go off of. I kind of semi disagree because some players either don't put themselves in positions to get hurt or they'll play better, or I shouldn't say they play better, but they still play well while injured. Like AJ Brown, he plays hurt. It doesn't matter if he's got a sprain, a high ankle sprain or something like that. He usually plays and he still plays at a high level. There are other players that don't necessarily do that. So that's kind of also something I'm really thinking about when I'm drafting an early round player. Like AJ Brown, in my opinion, he kind of has a little bit more of a value notch, in my opinion, just because I know I've had him on my team multiple times. And there's a lot of times where I'm reading the injury report and I'm thinking to myself, he's not playing. I got to find something else. And turns out he ends up playing and not only does that, but has a productive evening. We're real fast as well. Real fast. Garrett Wilson, and then surrounding him is Puka Nacua.
Yeah, he almost always goes, after Puka.
Yes.
Puka is a guy that like I have no problem with. Like when you look at like the history of players that like where like a wide receiver comes out of nowhere and has this huge season, then he's drafted highly in fantasy football. Those guys have been more stable than like the running backs. So it's funny, we have the two Rams players. We have him and Kyron Williams. And like running backs have been a lot more fragile. Like when a late round running back comes out of nowhere, has like huge season, he's drafted highly. Like those guys have way higher bust rates. Like when you look at so like I pulled some stuff here, like the for the history as I pull up here for Puka Nacua. The only wide receivers in the top 20 of rookie seasons overall for fantasy that did not go on to have another wide receiver one scoring season over the course of their careers were Kelvin Benjamin, Eddie Royal, Michael Clayton, not from the George Clooney movie, and Tampa Bay, Mike Williams. The other guys all got there multiple seasons where they hit. Running back's a lot more fragile. We obviously just lived this recently with a guy like James Robinson. Everyone, goes to the past, Steve Slayton, there's all these guys. Like finding the next Arian Foster is very hard to do. Those guys have been a lot more fragile. Like you think about some of the other running backs that we've had over that tenure. There's like some real ghosts of the past, like Peyton Hillis, dudes like that, Thomas Rawls, Philip Lindsay recently, like that, right? Like those guys, they draft high, they huge bust. They don't get the same workload that they had the same year before. They don't have as much touchdown luck. Things go wrong, but wide receivers have been more stable. The one pause I have a little bit with Puka Nacua aggressively playing him in the first round is just the splits, like with and without Cooper Kupp. Like he was a lot more volatile than he was at the start of the season. Obviously, you get off to like that massive runway, right? Like the first 4 weeks of the seasons where he just went nuclear. And then, like I said, there's a lot more volatility crept in. 207 routes he ran with Kupp off the field last year. He was targeted on 31.4% of those routes, 2.96 yards per route run. Immaculate wide receiver one type numbers. He was the wide receiver 2 in expected fantasy points per game on that workload. He ran 397 routes last year with Kupp on the field. And he still led the team in target rate, but that 31.4% rate went down to 26.4%. His yards per route down to 2.66. He went from the wide receiver 2 in expected points to the wide receiver 10 in expected points. So like he's a little bit closer to where his expected points were, and then it allows some guys to kind of creep into the conversation with him. So those are kind of like some of the reasons where I think he's appropriately priced. He's not someone like I'm necessarily out on, but I'm also not necessarily bullish on either.
So right now we'll dive into another mini hypothetical. Your pick, so a majority of Yahoo leagues, if you were to join a public one, I believe it's 10-person, half-point PPR, 2 wide receivers. That's usually the default, unless the commissioner goes in and changes it manually. That's kind of the default rules. So say you end up being pick 10. Right now, you had a standard. They took the highest ADP available. Right now, you got Puka Nacua, Garrett Wilson, Jonathan Taylor, Jahmyr Gibbs, Devontae Adams. Those are the picks that are kind of available for you. Who are you double tapping?
Yeah, that's pretty interesting there. Like I said, I'm definitely looking at kind of Garrett Wilson to be one of those guys. I have no problem taking Garrett Wilson even over Nacua. I just think that his trajectory is very much like when you look at what we want to have, like a runway to have like one of these elite wide receiver seasons. Like you're looking at, all right, like offensive attachment. We're like I said, I'm a little bit more I think Rodgers is a little more competent than most. So he's got quarter play. Where are you on the age spectrum? Both these guys kind of, have that. I think his schedule is a little bit better. The Jets have a little more favorable passing schedule than what we have. They have a tougher rush schedule than projected passing schedule. And then surrounding target competition. Puka Nacua plays at Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp's not going to just roll over and die, right? Like, especially a healthier version of Cooper Kupp coming into the season, whereas Garrett Wilson's going to be competing with Mike Williams coming off of an ACL and Malachi Corley, right? Like, so I do think that you can make the case for Garrett Wilson. I like him the most there. Like I said, I'm really hoping one of the running backs comes to me though if I'm in like that situation, right? Like a Bijan or Breece Hall gets there. Looking at, if AJ Brown is there, I'm smashing AJ Brown if he's there at that
Definitely.
point as well. But then on the return, if it gets a little bit more dicey, like if say like, because Nakua probably doesn't come back, right? I have no problem taking Devontae Adams on the teams where I get an elite wide receiver, right? Like if someone's in my tier 1 wide receivers, I have no problem double tapping. Where I have a problem double tapping Devontae Adams is when you're taking him with a guy that takes like more projection, like from that tier of guys that we're hoping makes the jump. Like I don't very often want to double tap Devontae Adams with Marvin Harrison, with Chris Olave, with a Drake London. I like playing the Devontae Adams angle because remember, Devontae Adams is at age 32 season. Like this historically has been like the cliff for wide receivers. Like you don't know. It's literally a coin flip whether this player is going to keep producing. And Devontae Adams has trended down 2 years in a row, not just in terms of surrounding quarterback play, which we don't know has been solved with just Gardner Minshew joining the Las Vegas Raiders, but also the stuff that is on Devontae Adams, stuff like his yak, it has declined too. So like he's definitely a player that I think you need to have some trepidation with. But if I have a chance to say pair Devontae Adams with a Tyreek Hill or a CeeDee Lamb when he goes in that late round 2, or even a Jefferson or Chase, and I can say, all right, I know I've got 300 targets in these 2 players, I feel a lot more insulation there. But I think you're open up for more of the volatility when, like you said, you're pairing Devontae Adams with like a Marvin Harrison, another guy who maybe doesn't get there. Chris Olave doesn't make the jump in that situation. That's when I'm a little more hesitant to take, Devontae Adams in those situations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, personally, I think I would be, if I'm pick number 10 and I got 2 picks in a row, I think I'll be double tapping Garrett Wilson and Puka Nacua if I'm definitely taking 2 wide receivers. Side note, just in case everybody was wondering, Puka Nacua in Samoan means Jerry Rice. And if that's the case, I got to take him right away.
But he eats no vegetables. I don't know if you saw that report.
Oh, yeah.
The man doesn't eat a vegetable.
Same. Him and I are alike. I'm halfway to being an NFL wide receiver. I like the guy already. So, especially if you're not taking your running back. If I kind of wanted to split it personally, if I wanted to split, get an elite wide receiver, get an elite, potentially elite running back, I think I would personally be going Jahmyr Gibbs over Jonathan Taylor. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, it's tough. I don't really love any guys in that range. I think the half point PPR does help out the argument for guys like Jonathan Taylor and Saquon, in kind of that mold. But I think, like you said, though, but one of the things I always look for is like neither one of these guys still has that profile. And granted, like Saquon's going to by far the best team that he's ever played for. Like, I mean, Saquon, he has 20 career runs where the Giants have been up more than a touchdown in the fourth quarter, right? He's going to be on a team that just is going to have more leads. He's going to be that player the Eagles can kind of turn to like at the end of games and run teams out, right? That's where Saquon makes a jump. But both of these guys play with what I talk about, mobile quarterbacks, right? Like you said, you talked about the tush push. Well, Jonathan Taylor plays with Anthony Richardson. Anthony Richardson had 40% of the team designed runs inside the 5-yard line when he was available. These guys aren't really check down guys. So like, it's tougher for me to bank on those guys. I think when you look at those guys, it's easy to make the bull case and say like, man, like they're going to be in good offenses. These teams can score points. I want to have attachment to those guys. But also, like, they're going to be a lot more volatile. They're not going to give you a lot of those games. Like, Christian McCaffrey can have a really bad – he can have a good fantasy game without a touchdown.
Yes.
The games that Saquon Barkley and Jonathan Taylor are going to have are going to be the games where they find the box. But the weeks that they don't find the paint, they're going to be a lot more volatile. Like, we've always done this with Derrick Henry, right? And luckily, Derrick Henry has scored a lot of touchdowns. But Derrick Henry's always been one of these players where, like, man, if Derrick Henry literally doesn't get a touchdown, what am I getting? Even if he has 100 rushing yards, like, I'm just not getting very many fantasy points out of that because he's not going to catch a lot of passes. And, like, you have that with Jonathan Taylor and Saquon Barkley and those outcomes. So I think that's where, like, you can use that as, like, the the case to break that tie between Jahmyr Gibbs and maybe those next tier of guys. Because Jahmyr Gibbs was literally like, even with David Montgomery in those final 10 games when both guys played, it was more of a 1A, 1B situation. He got some goal line carries still mixed in and still caught passes. And I think he's a chance where Jahmyr Gibbs can catch even more passes this year because of, like I laid out, with, does Jameson Williams become a guy that commands targets in this offense? There's no more Josh Reynolds. There is like a little bit more target availability in that offense. So he could even catch more passes in year 2, Jahmyr Gibbs, that is. And then you have the contingency value, right? Like, we had a month where David Montgomery didn't play. And in those games, Jahmyr Gibbs was as good for fantasy football as Christian McCaffrey. Like, in those 3 games, he scored 27.6, 29.9, and 26.2 PPR points. Like, that's what you want. So, like, you do get that contingency value that's not fully baked in if David Montgomery were to miss any time as well, too. But like I said, you have to look at these guys that play with these mobile quarterbacks. It definitely does cap some of their ceiling potential, especially in games they don't score touchdowns.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Running quarterbacks are a detriment to running back potential, running back production, I should say more specifically. But real quick, as we are approaching the hour mark, I don't want to make this episode too long. We're going to, I think, end in a discussion about Marvin Harrison Jr. because I have been met with a lot of backlash and pushback because I say, you know what? It's just not worth it. He's not a foundational piece, or he's too risky of a foundational piece for it to be worth taking a rookie wide receiver in the second round, mid-second round. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, he's been a tough click for me at price. Now, first of all, I do understand why he's there. Like, once we get past that firewall, like, we're starting to really, because wide receivers are, like we talked about to open the show, are inherently the positions being drafted earlier than it was. So it's a little bit different now when you say Marvin Harrison now is being drafted at like the 1-2 turn, because historically in years past, that might be like the wide receiver 5, wide receiver 6, right? We're talking like the wide receiver 10, wide receiver 11 now. And when you get to that gap, the guys that go alongside Marvin Harrison, it's easy to understand why he's being kind of priced near Drake London, why he's being priced near Chris Olave, right? Like, it is like, you understand that. My 2 problems I have with taking Marvin Harrison at that spot, one, are like historically, right? The only wide receiver that was top 10 in the NFL in the 2000s in terms of draft allocation that also was a wide receiver 1 in PPR points per game was Jamar Chase, right? Like, it's a very thin line to cut that edge. Like, you have a very thin margin of error. We're talking about guys like AJ Green, Julio Jones, Calvin Johnson, Larry Fitzgerald, dudes that are walking into the Hall of Fame were not that player in year 1, right? So, like, you just have, like I said, to cut it that close, I think it's tough. I do dabble them in a little bit when I do wide receiver to open, especially like if I get one of those guys that slides like an AJ Brown, I feel a little more insulation. But the other problem I have too is like the delta between him and Malik Neighbors, right? Because the real life draft delta was tight. You have one guy goes pick 4, one guy goes pick 6. But in fantasy drafts, one guy goes basically 10 wide receiver slots later. And there's a reason for that, the Daniel Jones factor versus the Kyler Murray factor. But we did see 2 years ago, Daniel Jones facilitated, viable fantasy weeks out of Darius Slayton and Isaiah Hodgins to close that season when Dayball was able like a coax a usable version of Daniel Jones. So, I mean, I just say like, all right, I can miss on Malik Neighbors in round 3, and it doesn't hurt me as much if I miss on Marvin Harrison at pick 12, right?
Yes.
And as that being like more of like kind of like the argument against it. But I do dabble a little bit in wide receiver opens when I get that AJ Brown. I think that's more of a case, but I do understand why he's going there.
Mm-hmm. It makes it so, I don't know, like me being a person who preaches foundational structure and having a solid foundation, I feel like drafting a rookie wide receiver in a difficult division with a quarterback who has injury history, you're asking for a lot to go right for you to just say, you know what? What if I just took Devontae Adams first and then just been done with it and not have to deal with it? Right. What if I just took Chris Olave or Saquon Barkley and just not have to deal with it? And that's kind of my take on that subject.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, it's hard. It's very hard to push back on that.
Yeah. So real quick, as I lose my train of thought, I wanted to talk about missing and missing on your picks, because a lot of people, and I do, of course, I stress the foundational and how they are foundational pieces. But it is, I want to emphasize, it is okay to miss. It's okay to miss on a player, and it's not going to absolutely end your season. When people say, "Oh, you know what? I took Austin Eckler last year, and that's why I didn't make the playoffs or my team didn't do well." I'm sorry, guys. I'm not buying that one out of you.
Right.
You know, you can definitely work the waiver wire. You have 15 other picks to make up for it. You're able to overcome deficiencies, especially in foundational pieces. Because if you look at any roster that you have had in the past last year, you don't even have to go that far. Look at a past draft, and you look from rounds 5 through the last pick. I guarantee you, maybe 1 to 2 players are still on your roster by the end of the season.
Yeah.
Maybe 1 to 2. You're going to miss on 80% of your picks, probably. And so I just want to reiterate, it is a-okay to miss on a pick. So you know what? If you do want the volatile pick, go for it. It's not going to hurt you that bad. Of course, it helps when it hits. It's definitely going to help, but it's not going to hurt you.
Listen, being right on players will always be more successful than being wrong on players.
Correct.
But also, like you said, I mean, you know, you'll be lucky to get through a seasonal redraft league where you end the season with like 50 to 60% of the roster you drafted, right? Like just through, you know, injuries, performances, all those different things. Like you'll just be lucky to get through it. Any league you've ever done. I had one of my most successful fantasy seasons last year, and one of my most heavily drafted second round players was Tony Pollard, who was objectively one of the worst picks that you could have made last year, because not only was Tony Pollard bad, he never got hurt or anything. Like you just kept playing him because he kept getting a bunch of touches. That's the worst kind of fantasy player. At least when you have a guy that gets hurt, you're like, you get replacement value. That guy leaves your lineup. You know, I would argue that Tony Pollard was one of the worst opening round picks. Like you brought up like an Eckler, right? Like Eckler was a bad pick because what were you supposed to do with him?
Yeah, exactly.
You had to keep playing him, right? Like, Garrett Wilson situation, right? Like you had to keep playing him, but structure is always going to matter. Like I said, if you're building around your league format and you're inherently building your rosters in a correct fashion where you're not, exposing yourself to opportunity cost by taking, an early round quarterback when you shouldn't, or, you're reaching on like tight end when there's like at one of the onesie positions when you've got like to fill 3 starting wide receiver spots and another flex spot. Like those things are always going to anchor you more when you miss on those players. And help you out. So I would definitely subscribe to that very much. League structure matters the most. Like understanding your format and what you're playing is easily the number one thing to account for.
Exactly. Now, of course, let's wrap up this episode. Mr. Rich, where could everybody find you?
So you can find all my work at sharpfootballanalysis.com. I'm putting together a draft kit there with Raymond Summerlin, where basically I put out stuff the entire summer, update that all summer. We just had the 2024 preview book that just came out on Amazon, and you can get that at Amazon or at sharpfootballanalysis.com. Check out, all my work, man.
What about on X or Twitter?
I'm at Twitter at Lord Reeves. I still do stick with the former Bird app of calling it. The X thing, what really bothers me the most about it is when you have it on your phone, like on your mobile, like it looks like a porn site. Like it's like, it's like,
hold on, I gotta look now.
Like it's like, what should I be going to this? Like,
yeah,
should I be going to this? Like
you know what? Now that you mention it, I'm not gonna get that scenario out of my head.
And to be fair, it basically is a porn site now.
If you click, what that pisses, what? That's my biggest gripe on using it, because you'll see like a article or like a clip of like nature, or you'll see like a clip like an article of like the news talking about a murder subject. You go to the comments to actually like see what they're talking about. All of a sudden, OnlyFans.
It's bio, baby.
It's so irritating. I'm not gonna lie.
Every time I'm like on my phone and I see it, I'm like, man, this looks like I'm going to a site I'm clicking an app I should be going to.
Yeah. This is definitely a not safe for work app. Especially, what pisses me off more about that, just because also there is that when I look at the comments, I expect the comments to be about the thing that I'm actually looking at, and it never is. That pisses me off even more.
Yeah, and I don't want to tell you, just the snowball into another thing, but like literally not one good thing has come from that app since it's been taken over.
Yeah, it's been pretty frustrating, not gonna lie. Pretty frustrating. All right, but that's gonna wrap up this episode.
Another podcast.
Yeah, that's a discussion for another time because it's a long rabbit hole that we're gonna be diving into now. But that's gonna wrap up this episode. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed it. I would recommend you guys to follow my ex, but I really don't want you guys to do it because I troll a lot. I don't want you guys to see it. I'll get canceled. I'm sorry. All right, but other than that, hey, good luck, everybody.
I'm ready for all today.